Good evening, everyone. I'm John O'Loughlin. Welcome to my channel. It's called McDuff Lives, and tonight, it's part three of the Occult Reset. That name has stuck with me. I think we've practically been talking about it for almost 5 nights now, since it was really the theme of when I was considering the subject of fear versus faith and courage, and also last night when we had a really interesting conversation, and I thought really worthwhile with Amber Connor, and so grateful for her time and contributions. Just real. This is real life, real people. How are we dealing with this? And one of the things that I have to admit to you is I'm quite disgusted at the whole thing. I'm worse than disgusted, but that's a word I'll use for now. I want to start with just over here on my Twitter, if you don't mind. I'm gonna, you know what? Maybe I'll ask Andy. Are you willing to put up my Twitter? Um, no, never mind. I'll do it. I actually had it queued up if I can remember how to share. Oh, Andy's got it. Okay. Okay. Go down to the graph. You'll see a graph after you go not very far. Here it is. Okay. Now let's make that nice and big where people can see it. And so this is, as it says on the right there, a glance at the Swiss near-time monitoring of intensive care occupancy. That means the occupancy of the intensive care beds in the hospitals in Switzerland. And it covers the entire period. I think it's like 6 months to 6 months, or maybe longer. But you see at the beginning there, there's like it's like zero, and as you go up, the upward axis shows you how many beds are occupied. And then as time goes along, you go into 2021, just past halfway across the graph. Now, the lines that I think are the most important, I want to start with. So let's start with the bottom, which is the yellow one. And the yellow one is adult COVID ICU patients. Okay. So at the beginning, let's say that's the beginning of 2020 or so, there was a spike, and then it went way down to zero, almost as it is at zero. I mean, it stayed flat at zero until the fall, probably what's that, maybe October or so of 2020. And then it starts going up and stays fairly high during the winter, and then it starts going down as we hit the spring. A little bit of a bump there, maybe what's that, April or May or so, and then it flattens out toward the end of the year with a slight curve upward at the bottom. Now, look at the green curve. The green curve is the adult non-COVID ICU patients. So you see what you have here is you have the yellow one are people that are in the ICU and they have COVID. They're diagnosed with COVID. The green one is people that are in the ICU that are diagnosed with not having COVID. Now, the reason that this strikes me so important is that if you look at the yellow one and the green one, they are exact opposites. They're exact opposites. So as the yellow one had a little spike at the beginning, the green one went down at the beginning. Then as the green one goes up, the yellow one crosses it and goes down. And for the 7 or 8 months of the yellow one being at zero, the green one is up at 600 or so. You can see 500 on the left, so I'm just projecting that that's about 600. And then in the winter, as the winter comes along, the two lines cross again, with the green one, non-COVID, going down and the COVID going up. Then in the springtime, they cross again as the yellow one's going down, the green one's going up. And even they mirror each other, even in that little bump there around the springtime of 2021. So I hope that you can follow my logic here, which is that if you're diagnosed with COVID, or if you're diagnosed with non-COVID, determines which one of those graphs you get on. You're either on the yellow one or the green one. But now if you look at the black one, which is all adult ICU patients, that's basically flat except for a bump in the middle of the winter. Okay? So the answer is, as the comment says on the right there, um, the fundamental, and I don't know if I want to use the word because I might end up with a Robert David Steele outcome, but it's a fundamental SCAM of the global corona crime against humanity, misdiagnosis. Misdiagnosis. Well, how does a misdiagnosis happen? Is it so easy to just say, okay, well, I think this one looks a little bit more like a COVID and this one looks a little less like a COVID and blah, blah, blah. Is it like dealing cards or like flipping a coin? That's what it looks like. If you look at that graph, it looks like, the doctors were all leaning, towards COVID for a while, and then they all leaned towards non-COVID for a while, and then they went back to COVID for a while, or whoever does the diagnosis. And that is a real evidence. That is real evidence that something funny is going on with these diagnoses, and also that the real bottom line is that there's not a a pandemic because the hospital beds, there's only 500 or 600 of them at any one time. They've got 1,500 available on the chart, if not more. So where is the actual sign of a real pandemic? Okay, there's a lawyer in Germany by the name of Rainer Fulmich. He's also from California, and he's got an awful lot of play on YouTube and otherwise. He's been interviewing people like Mike Adams, the health ranger, um, uh, Dr. David Martin, the expert on patents, and uh, the uh, the point of his work is to show that the that this whole thing, and I'm being careful with my words, is uh, is one of those. Well, you know what I mean. That it's not real. And there was an interesting exchange between him and Steve Bannon that was recorded on a site called AFP Fact Check, which I'm just going to read to you because I think it's interesting to just set forth the different claims. And notice I'm not claiming either anybody's right here. I just am reading what the claim is. And the caption is that coronavirus was not staged by philanthropists to control people, by Ian Timberlake, published June 17th, 2021 at AFP Fact Check, AFP.com. Okay. A German lawyer claims in a video interview with Steve Bannon that the coronavirus pandemic was planned by global elites, including the Rockefeller Foundation, as part of an elaborate scheme to exert control of citizens. To do this, governments used PCR tests to justify lockdowns and other measures, the lawyer alleges. This is false. While the Rockefeller Foundation and other experts did study pandemic scenarios, they in no way fabricated a deadly outbreak, and health authorities say PCR tests are reliable. Yes, I remember this is a fact check organization, so but it's worth like often it's interesting to read, what they say. Okay. Quote, revealed how globalists planned the COVID-19 pandemic for 10 years, unquote, says a June 10th, 2021 Facebook post. It features an interview by Bannon, once an advisor to President Trump, with the lawyer Rainer Fuellmich. The video post has been viewed 92,000 times and has also appeared in an online article elsewhere on Facebook and on Twitter. Similar claims by Fuellmich were debunked by AFP Factual in October 2020. Quote, concrete plans for this pandemic were made by very rich and powerful people some 10 years ago, among them the Rockefeller Foundation, Fuellmich tells Bannon. And the final, I guess you could call a dry run, was Event 201, which happened in October of 2019, unquote. He added later in the interview, the people who are in back of this don't care about money. They care about control. Now here's our fact checker clearing us up. The Rockefeller Foundation is a philanthropic organization whose interests include public health, medical science, and a global food system. Yeah, I bet they do. It commissioned a report titled Scenarios for the Future of Technology and International Development. The report, issued in 2010, was the result of a year-long project that used scenario planning to explore the role of technology in international development and implications for the poor and vulnerable. Of the four imagined outcomes, one involved a 2012 global pandemic when, quote, national leaders around the world flexed their authority, a trend that intensified after the pandemic, according to the scenario. Another included large-scale catastrophes, among them a once-in-a-millennium drought linked to climate change, and which led to weakened government power, contrary to the first hypothetical outcome. Quote, please keep in mind that the scenarios in this report are stories, not forecasts, unquote. The document cautioned, urging readers to regard dates and other specifics as proxies, quote, not as necessary conditions for any particular scenario to unfold. It added, importantly, scenarios are not predictions, unquote. Well, I guess we got that straight, don't we? Not predictions. Ashley Chang, the foundation's head of media relations, skip ahead. The Rockefeller Foundation did not and is not fabricating a pandemic, quote unquote. That's case closed. They're not doing it. She said the report aimed to help governments and development professionals make better plans to actually address a real pandemic, such as the one we have today, quote unquote. Fuellmich also refers to Event 201 as evidence that the pandemic was planned. Event 201 was a tabletop exercise with leaders from business, government, and healthcare examining responses to a hypothetical pandemic. The Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security hosted the exercise in October 2019 in partnership with the World Economic Forum and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Gates has been a frequent target of misinformation, including that he plans control of the world through vaccination. For this scenario, we modeled a fictional coronavirus pandemic, but we explicitly stated that it was not a prediction, unquote, the Johns Hopkins Center said for what, the third time in the 2020 statement. Yeah. AFP has previously debunked other claims that cited Event 201 as evidence that the pandemic was preordained, including the August 2020 film Plandemic Indoctrination. Well, and Fulmick claims that the global elites used an accident at a Chinese lab simply as the springboard to set their pandemic into motion using PCR tests. Polymerase chain reaction, or PCR tests, are a commonly used means to identify the presence of SARS-CoV-2, period. Okay. Reliable tests. In an email to AFP on January 22nd, 2021, the WHO said since the beginning of 2020, WHO has received 10 reports of problems related to PCR tests for the detection of SARS-CoV-2. The reports were for misdiagnosis, both false and false negative results. 10 reports is a tiny fraction of the tests conducted in the United States, which by June 17, 2021 had exceeded 458 million, according to the CDC. Okay, so Steve Bannon and Reiner Fuellmich had an interview, and in that interview, Fuellmich said that it's the Rockefellers, it's the Rockefeller Foundation. And it's interesting, isn't it? Um, we've spent what, 30–40% of my time here on McDuff Lives talking about the Rockefellers. Most recently, been reading about Nelson Rockefeller and the way he just took over South and Central America. It's an amazing thing to have enough money to just take control of entire continents. Of course, we can go back behind Rockefeller to Morgan and behind Morgan to Rothschild, and we can say, well, yeah, it all comes from the old ancient empire, the great old pile of money that still exists and provides financing for those that are evil enough to do their bidding. Do you take the king's coin? Well, if you do, you got to do the king's will. Pardon me a second. Hi, Stephen Pickering says even the name SARS syndrome refers to a disease of the immune system, not of a pathogen. Yeah, a disease of the immune system, and that's what they've been. This is what these doctors have been focused on for their careers, right? The immune system, and that's what happened to my dad. Is that hepatitis that they gave him is attack on his immune system, so that later, when it was time to get rid of him, the cancer was effective. The attacks on immune system have been part of this whole effort. Uh, you might also say, attacks on the lungs have been part of it. And the aerosolization of pathogens has been a huge part of what they've been doing. And, nobody has turned this up publicly more than George Webb has. He's done a fabulous job of showing how the aerosolized poisons are real. And no matter what you think about COVID itself, or whether it's just a misnomer, a misdiagnosis for a flu or a common cold or a case of RSV, which I've just been learning about, a respiratory syncytial virus, which is an interesting virus that's called syncytial, which is when a cell expands and has to have more than one nucleus. Well, anyway, this business of all of these things that attack your immune system has been part of the science that they've been studying, especially you just once you look into Dr. Leonard Horowitz's work, which Mark Kulak has pointed to many times, and I would point to it too. The Special Virus Cancer Project, what is that about? They're trying to figure out a way to give people cancer with viruses as a way of assassinating them. Wow. Hmm. Now, who could we think of that they might have done that to? Okay, I want to go to John Rappaport's blog from today, and I think I'll just read, if you don't mind. You can now find it yourself at blog.nomorefakenews.com. This is John Rappaport, a blogger who I'm just now getting familiar with, and I'm very impressed by this from today, September 1st, 2021. CDC/FDA Smoking Gun of Smoking Guns by John Rappaport. They confess they had no virus when they concocted the test for the virus. They, quote, contrived, unquote, a model by pretending to find what they wanted to find. It's called a self-fulfilling prophecy. This is the con and the crime that drove millions of lives and economies into ruin. The CDC has issued a document that bulges with devastating admissions. The release is titled, quote, 07/21/2021 Lab Alert Changes to CDC RT-PCR for SARS-CoV-2 testing, unquote. It begins explosively. Quote, after December 31st, 2021, CDC will withdraw the request to the U.S. Food and Drug Administration for emergency use authorization of the CDC 2019 novel coronavirus real-time RT-PCR diagnostic panel. The assay first introduced in February 2020 for detection of SARS-CoV-2 only. CDC is providing this advance notice for clinical laboratories to have adequate time to select and implement one of the many FDA authorized alternatives. Many people believe, unquote. Now, this back to John Rappaport's comments. Many people believe this means the CDC is giving up on the PCR test as a means of, quote, detecting the virus, unquote. The CDC isn't saying that at all. They're saying the PCR technology will continue to be used, but they're replacing what the test is looking for with a better reference sample, a better marker, a better target, a better piece of RNA supposedly derived from SARS-CoV-2. CDC/FDA are confessing that there has been a problem, and um, capital letters for that word, problem, with the PCR test, which has been used to detect the virus starting in February of 2020, right up to this minute. In other words, the millions and millions of COVID cases, unquote, based on the PCR test in use are all suspect. Actually, that statement is too generous. Every test result of every PCR test should be thrown out. To confirm this, the CDC document links to an FDA release titled, quote, SARS-CoV-2 Reference Panel Comparative Data, unquote. Here is a killer quote. During the early months of the corona disease 2019, parentheses COVID-19, pandemic, clinical specimens, parentheses of the virus, were not readily available to developers of IVDs, that's in vitro diagnostics, to detect SARS-CoV-2. Therefore, the FDA authorized IVDs based on available data from contrived samples generated from a range of SARS-CoV-2 material sources. Parentheses, for example, gene-specific RNA, synthetic RNA, or whole genome viral RNA, close parentheses, for analytical and clinical performance evaluation. While validation using these contrived specimens provided a measure of confidence in test performance at the beginning of the pandemic, it is not feasible to precisely compare the performance of various tests that used contrived specimens because each test validated performance using samples derived from different gene-specific, synthetic, or genomic nucleic acid sources, unquote. Translation. We at the CDC did not have a specimen of the SARS-CoV-2 virus when we concocted the PCR test for SARS-CoV-2. Yes, it's unbelievable, right? And that's the test we've been using all along. So we contrived samples of the virus. We fabricated, we lied, we made up, invented synthetic gene sequences, and we said these sequences had to be close to the sequence of SARS-CoV-2 without having the faintest idea of what we were doing because, again, we didn't have an actual specimen of the virus. We had no proof there was something called SARS-CoV-2. This amazing FDA document goes on to say the agency has granted emergency approval to 59 different PCR tests since the beginning of the pandemic. And I won't say the word in parentheses. 59. And, quote, it is not feasible to precisely compare the performance of various tests that use contrived specimens because each test validated performance using samples derived from different gene-specific, synthetic, or genomic nucleic acid sources, unquote. Translation, each of the 59 different PCR tests for SARS-CoV-2 told different lies and concocted different fabrications about the genetic makeup of the virus we didn't have. Obviously, then, these tests would give unreliable results. The PCR tests used contrived specimens of the virus we didn't have. But don't worry, be happy now because the CDC and the FDA say they really do have actual virus samples of SARS-CoV-2 from patients. They have better targets for the PCR tests, and labs should start gearing up for the new and improved tests. In other words, they were lying then, but they're not lying now. They were contriving, but now they're telling the truth. If you believe that, I have a fountain of youth water for sale, extracted from the lead-contaminated system of Flint, Michigan. Here, once again, I report Virology's version of, quote, we isolated the virus, unquote. They have a soup they make in their labs. This soup contains human and monkey cells, toxic chemicals and drugs, and all sorts of other random genetic material. Because the cells start to die, the researchers assume a bit of mucus from a patient they dropped in the soup is doing the killing, and the virus must be the killer agent in the mucus. This assumption is entirely unwarranted. The drugs and chemicals could be doing the cell killing. And the researchers also are starving the cells of vital nutrients, and that starvation could kill the cells. There's no proof that SARS-CoV-2 is in the soup, or that it is doing the cell killing, or that it exists. Yet the researchers call cell death, quote, isolation of the virus. To say this is a non sequitur is a vast understatement. In their universe, quote, we assume without proof we have the virus buried in a soup, in a dish, in the lab, equals, quote, we've separated the virus from all surrounding material, unquote. Virology equals how to spread BS for a living and scare the world, unquote. Other than that, it's perfect. And that is the essay by John Rappaport. Now, I don't know enough to say whether he's right or wrong about all this stuff. I want that to be clear. But it is a fair comment to say, my God, how could you devise a test that everybody in the world is relying upon without having the virus to make the test with? That to me, add that on top of the Snohomish County man that can't be found, the first case in the United States that, and then the story of Dr. Li in China, the ophthalmologist that worked at the General Hospital in Wuhan. And, how did he die? He died supposedly of COVID in China. The doctor that diagnosed that, and I am just Dr. Drosten, Dr. Christian Drosten, the German doctor who had actually discovered SARS-1 and was the go-to doc, I guess, in Germany when the first case appeared, was reported in January. And it's a miracle how fast the PCR test became the diagnostic tool of choice that has lasted up to this minute, as was said in that article. I want to now play, if I can, a video. And this one is, it's only been seen 609 times. It's an interview by somebody named Brettina of Kevin McKernan. Now, Kevin McKernan is kind of a famous guy. He's been one of the patent kings of the medical marijuana business. So he's an expert in genome from the plant side. So interesting to hear his comments about what's going on. And I think this young lady asked some good questions. So let me see if I can't once again score a hit here and get my screen shared. Yeah.
I'm here again with Kevin McKernan. Kevin is CSO, is that right? CSO of Medicinal Genomics?
Yes.
Okay.
That's
awesome.
right.
And also co-author of this report. So I'm going to ask you to explain this. This is, by the way, the first time that I've had someone come on by request. So I had a listener contact me and request that you come on to explain this because this was big news. And I'm going to ask you to explain that. But essentially, there was a report called the Corman-Drosten report, and let's just start by if you can tell me what was that and why is it so significant to testing and to COVID-19 and to testing for COVID-19? What was the significance of that?
Okay, so this is in many ways, it's kind of equivalent to the Genesis block of PCR for COVID. The first test that was ever released was from the Drosten laboratory at the Charité in Berlin. So very early work. This gentleman is very well published, highly regarded. People have called him the Fauci of Germany. Okay, so he's got very big reach. He discovered SARS-1. There's many publications I will reference throughout this that accolade him in the work that he's doing in other places. I was asked into this review to kind of scrutinize the PCR side of things. And I didn't really appreciate who he was or his background when I was asked to do that. And so it was somewhat of a neutral party. And I think that's why they asked me to do it, because I admitted to not even knowing who the guy was about a month ago. And they were surprised that I didn't know who he was. So that being said, I dug into this, and I was somewhat reserved throwing stones at somebody who developed the first test, because I know from an entrepreneurial standpoint, when a pandemic happens, you have to cut some corners and get things out quickly. And I didn't want to be the person who was an ambulance chasing lawyer going after the entrepreneur who did this. I thought that was not a good precedent to set. What changed my opinion on this was all the conflicts that were involved in the peer review process. And I happen to have a soft spot in my heart for bad peer review, because I think that whole system is broken and leads to false appeals to authority, which has happened in this case. So this is the first PCR protocol that was ever developed for SARS-CoV-2. It was designed very early on, before they actually had the virus in their hands. I think only 6 people were dead at the time when this was done. This is back in early January of 2020. And the protocol quickly went to a laboratory there in Berlin. I think it's called Labor Lab Berlin. I'll have to reference you a link for that to make sure I haven't misspelled that. And also to a biotech company that sells kits internationally for testing. It also made it to the WHO's website and to the WHO prior to it going into peer review. And that alone isn't a crime. It's just looks poor when you see that the peer review went to a journal that the authors of this paper were also on the editorial board of, and it went through a 24-hour peer review. Now, that may not strike some people as odd, but if you go and chart all of the peer reviews that have ever come out of this journal, it is an outlier. It's the fastest one that's ever happened. The next closest one is 20 days, and the average is 179 days. All right, so this really raced through without a lot of review. So this got many people concerned that it could be the source of false positives or false negatives. I think our report focuses more on the false positives because those have a little bit more public outrage than the false negatives. But the fact is, we know that these primers produce both. This is what we can further document here, perhaps in this podcast and other places. But there's several peer-reviewed publications that have come out critiquing these primers politely. But nevertheless, if you read between the lines, they are recommending getting rid of them. Interestingly enough, Christian Drosten himself is the author on one of them. That information was public in June 18th in a paper from a gentleman known as, the lead author is probably going to murder the pronunciation of his name, but it's Munchoff, Munchhoff. That paper concludes on getting rid of these primers because they're not reliable.
So just can I stop you there? For people who don't know what a primer is, what are we talking about?
So in PCR, the core ingredients of PCR, the things that drive its specificity are like 20 base sequences of DNA that we can synthesize in a laboratory, but we need to know what the sequence is to do it. So in this case, they had some sequence from China, and they also had the historical SARS virus. And so they filled in some gaps in their mind as to where they could put these primers in the genome to amplify DNA. They usually have to be about 100 bases apart. And there's usually 3 pieces of DNA that they need to make. They need to make a forward primer, a reverse primer, and then usually a probe that sits between the 2 of them. And when PCR begins to amplify, it kind of amplifies the regions between the 2 primers and only that 100 base pair region. And if the probe hybridizes to that region, it gets cleaved in the process of amplification, and that what they call hydrolysis event brings you fluorescence to the reaction. So you can track the course of PCR in real time by monitoring the cleavage rate of that probe.
So just to clarify, so the primer is basically when you're running a PCR test, the primer is what you're using as the reference to compare the sample to. That's
kind of like your crosshairs of your rifle. If they're not specific, they'll amplify too many things and the wrong things. So you really need them to be uniquely designed to only amplify your target and screen them to make sure they don't amplify off of each other. Like the primers their DNA too. They can hybridize to themselves and amplify themselves instead of amplifying your target. Or they can hit human DNA, or they can hit, Pantia. They can hit a host of other microbes by accident and amplify those. So it's important that you do a lot of in silico work before, where you take the sequences and you scan them against databases to make sure that they're unique in the genomes that you're trying to target, so that you don't end up amplifying other things that could be in the background of the biological sample you collect. Now, I want to hit on that point of specificity right here, because it often gets lost in communication with people, which is that when you get a biological sample, a lot of people don't realize that oftentimes that comes with 20% of the DNA in the sample being microbial. It's not human. It's stuff that's in your biome, like in your saliva is known to produce lots of microbial DNA when you do saliva isolation. So you got to make sure your primers don't hit all those microbes. I don't know what the diversity is in your nasopharyngeal cavity either, but I'm sure it's not only human. There's going to be other viruses and other bacteria that are present in those samples. So you have to kind of come to recognize and appreciate the fact that when we're testing for these things to behave in a given laboratory, we're usually under ideal circumstances, we're spiking in synthesized RNA to see if the test works on that, but it doesn't have the background of all the microbial junk and all the human DNA. So under those ideal circumstances, you can often get PCR to work and then publish your paper and run with it. But what really is the test of time is doing it across biological samples that have all of the background complexity present. It's really important to do this with RNA tests, because RNA is more complex than DNA, and that many genomes make RNA and splice it and cut and paste all the different parts of RNA together to make a much more complex picture of what we call the transcriptome. And so if you're not testing this in real biological samples, it's very hard to predict all of the complexity of the background from in silico studies alone. Mm-hmm. So a lot of critiques of our work, and in this peer review of the Drosten paper, have come down to kind of attacking us, saying you didn't lift up a single pipette to do this. You really should wet test these ideas, and they're right about that. They're absolutely right about that. The reason we didn't focus on the wet testing is that there's already 5 other peer-reviewed papers that did that for us and show really damaging information regarding these primers amplifying water.
Wow. And can you give,
Did I lose you there?
Yeah,
Sorry,
I think you froze up a little for a second there. Wow. Can you give me links to those later?
Yes, I'll give you a link for this. I can recite a few of them off the top of my head.
All right, I'm going to stop it there. I think it's kind of interesting to point something out to you before we go. Does anybody see the unicorn? You see that? You see the unicorn? All right, it's right there on that little quilter thing that she's got behind her. And interesting, isn't it? I start looking for symbols and things in the background of everything now, and I think it's something that you can do too. You notice they're trying to reduce our vocabularies. They're trying to turn our language into just a few hundred or maybe a couple thousand words. And they're also kind of teaching us to use symbols instead of language at all. Emojis is a huge example of that. Then all of the symbols that we are being told to use, with our hands now, and make a little heart, right? It says, I love you. I love you. I do. Especially Andy. I love Andy above all other men. It's true. But that's something that is just in the background, as she just happened to love unicorns. She grew up with that generation that watches the little girls TV shows with the dancing horses with unicorns, or is that a symbol of, hey, I'm with this group or that group? Who knows? I don't know. I never saw this lady before, but I think she did a good job of bringing out the right questions. And the answers, and I do accept this man as an expert. The answer is that there was no testing of the test. How can you test the test if you don't have the subject matter that the test is to test? It's absurd. You don't even need to expand any more than that. You just say, well, you can't test something if you don't have an example of it to construct a test with. But then what they did was they went back and they said, well, this is a kind of a SARS type of thing. Let's go back and look at SARS one and take some stuff from there and kind of fill in the gaps and you know what was the word? They uh, contrived. They contrived the sample and built a test around the contrived sample. But then it wasn't just the one, that there was 56 different ones approved, 56 different PCR tests. So that's not useful data. Why is it that everything that seems sensible doesn't get done in this? Why isn't it we don't know who patient zero is by now, patient one? Why is this so opaque and obscured and occult? Because occult means hidden. And all of this is hidden. And that's why I say, don't discount the idea, of Klaus. It's not about the virus. It's not about the vaccine. It's about the Great Reset. The Great Reset. The Great Reset is the launch of the fourth industrial revolution. Do you know what the fourth industrial revolution is? The fourth industrial revolution is transhumanism. It's when they put something in you that they can communicate with. And you may be seduced into it, like getting an Apple wristwatch or something. But, and they wanted us to do the RFID chips, remember? And a lot of employers got that. And people have it under their arms. And I know probably in third world countries, it probably is still going on a lot. But here in America, it wasn't popular. We didn't like it enough. And I guess we had enough power to say no to RFID chips. But how else are they going to get something into us? Well, it could be that Reiner Fulmick is right about this. I don't know. I I just don't know. And that's why I'm so frustrated. Because, the possibilities that we're being presented with are not all the possibilities either. I mean, you could say, okay, either on the one hand, this is a real uh, weapon, a biological weapon that's going to get worse and worse and worse because they're going to control us. And they're going to use it to shut down our economy and keep us locked down. And it's going to just get worse and worse and worse because they're using it as a weapon. That's a possibility. I'm not saying that's what's happening. I'm saying it's a possibility when you're trying to consider of all the ideas out there, which ones could be going on. Well, you have prominent people saying that it's China, China, China. No, I don't think so, but some pretty smart people are saying that, you know? Or is it the deep state? Is it the old money that's finally decided to just flee, just pick up their bags, pick up their money, and go. Go live in that Shangri-La that they've built for themselves somewhere, and one day just turn off the lights at the stock exchange and say goodbye. Or is it just greed? Is it the greed of the military industrial complex, just wanting more and more military contracts because that's how they live? That's what they do. That's how they get that next golf club membership that they need so bad for the next advance in their career. How else could they pay for it? It's expensive. Kids in college. So I love the fact that we can talk about this at least a little bit tonight. I kind of was a little bit dishonest in naming the program tonight because the occult part of it is not so much about uh, Helena Blavatsky or the Vril Society or you know it's not that kind of occult. The occult is the magic, the magical hand that hides what it's doing, the sleight of hand that says, look at this, look over here, and magically you've just lost your wallet or your freedom or your country. Thanks for being with me tonight.